Hello, good evening. Today we are going to start a webinar on when to deliver in complicated pregnancy. I'm Dr. Swapna. I'm a consultant in Rainbow Hospital, Hyderabad branch. So we know that 8 to 10% of all pregnancies have some complications, whether it can be maternal complications or fetal complications. We as obstetricians, we know the purpose of the antenatal care is to balance between these and have a safe mother and safe baby. It's a very we need to take care of two lives, both mom and baby, right? So now the dilemma comes when there's a complicated pregnancy, when to deliver the baby, to wait, risking the mother, will mother go into complications if we wait, or to deliver and then land a baby having a preterm. So there are some guidelines for many of these, but everything needs to be individualized and looked into more care for the mother and baby, and both lives needs to be taken into consideration and decision needs to be taken. Now we're going to just assist you helping out what are the guidelines which are there in each complicated pregnancy regarding taking the decision when to deliver the baby. Okay, so that there's a proper balance between mother's health and risking the baby to the preterm or without waiting for long and having perinatal complications to the baby. So that needs to be a very small balance. Okay. Now coming to what complications, we'll go step by step coming to each complications. First thing is preterm premature rupture of the membranes. As we all know that any rupture of membranes after 24 weeks and before 37 weeks is called preterm premature rupture of the membranes. In such cases, if we have seen any water break, which is in between these gestational ages, we normally in Rainbow admit the patient at least for 48 to 72 hours. First thing is examine to look what is vitals of the patient, whether any uterus is contracting, whether uterine height is corresponding to the gestational age, and do a speculum examination, look for the color of the liquor, and vaginal swab is collected. If she is not contracting, we normally internal examination is not done. And blood investigations are sent along with the high vaginal swab. Fetus is assessed with the CTG and ultrasound. In ultrasound, we check for the position of the baby, amniotic fluid, and growth of the baby. What is the weight? Is it adequate to the gestational age or more or less? Now, what do we do after admission? After sending the investigations, antibiotics are started. Routinely, we normally start with erythromycin, 250 milligrams QID until the culture report comes. If culture is sensitive, erythromycin is continued for 10 days. If it is resistant, then we change to the antibiotic which is sensitive. Only co-amoxiclav is not administered because there is a risk of necrotizing enterocolitis in preterm babies if co-amoxiclav is administered. So that is not given. And they are covered with antenatal steroids. Magnesium sulfate is given for any woman who is in imminent delivery is there. We are expecting them to deliver. So a magnesium sulfate is administered for less than 32 weeks. And the tocolysis is given until the steroid is covered. Normally here we use nifedipine. Now, when do we deliver? Is in case immediately delivery, if there are any signs of chorioamnionitis or any bleeding or any fetal compromise, or after she's still in labor, even after tocolysis, the patient is delivered. And if nothing is there, there is no chorioamnionitis and it's just only leak, then we normally do the expectant management. Now, expectant management is we discharge the patient, ask the patient to monitor her temperature 3 times daily, look for any change in the color of her liquor, and any pain, abdomen, tenderness, foul smelling, discharge, baby movements. In case if any temperature is rising and baby is not moving or change in the color or foul smell, she needs to report to hospital immediately. And if any signs, she is delivered. So we normally continue expectant management till 34 weeks. If nothing, no signs or symptoms of chorioamnionitis and CTG is fine and A5 is more than 5, After 34 weeks, the decision is discussed with the couple, saying regarding still continuing what are the advantages and disadvantages, but not more than 37 weeks. Coming to other complication, one of the most common is diabetes mellitus, whether it is gestational or pre-gestational. We are not going to know how the details of management of diabetes. We all know about it. The only thing is now we should know when to deliver. A very well-controlled diabetes without any complications like polyhydramnios or large for gestational age fetus can be wait up to 40 weeks. RCOG says up to 41 weeks like any other pregnancy if no other complication. Now, well controlled is not monitoring sugars once in 2 weeks or something. It is twice weekly monitoring all 4 values of fasting, 2 hours or 1 hour post meal, and they're being under control. So if well controlled diabetes without any complications can wait for natural labor till 40 weeks. RCOG also says till 41. In a well controlled gestational diabetes on insulin without any complications or on metformin without any complications can be continued till 39 weeks. RCOG says till 40 weeks. Okay. And gestational diabetes with uncontrolled blood sugars, the blood sugars are fluctuating or associated if controlled blood sugars, but if there is a polyhydramnios or there is a large for gestational age fetus, then we need to monitor both mother and baby till 38 weeks and do not go beyond 38 weeks and deliver, induce or planned section depending upon the pelvic assessment. In pre-gestational diabetes, if well controlled without complications, can wait till 39 weeks, but not beyond that. So all these, when the decision to deliver in diabetes is there, there need to be proper documentation of how well her sugars are controlled. Any other effects are there on the fetus, like what is the correct gestational age, what is the amniotic fluid pattern, how can the mother monitor movements, all these needs to be taken into control and decision needs to be taken. Next, coming to hypertensive disorders, this is one of the most common reason for preterm deliveries, preterm births in the world. Now coming to the definitions, gestational hypertension is any hypertension after 20 weeks more than 140 by 90 without proteinuria. With proteinuria is mild preeclampsia. So any gestational hypertension or mild preeclampsia or chronic hypertension without renal disease or superimposed preeclampsia should be delivered by 37 to 38 weeks, not going beyond that. Now, early delivery before 37 weeks should be considered in severe preeclampsia, like inability to control blood pressure, even with 3 or more classes of antihypertensive drugs in appropriate doses. And if pulse oximeter of maternal pulse is less than 90 percentile and progressive deterioration in renal functions or liver function or HELLP syndrome, or eclampsia or severe headaches, repeated visual scotomas, placental abruption, and in coming to the fetus with REDF and non-reassuring CTGs needs to be delivered early. Now coming to small for gestational age, 60% of our NICU is from small for gestational age fetuses. Now, definition of small for gestational age or fetal growth restriction is any fetus which is less than 10th centile of expected fetal weight at that gestation, or abdominal circumference less than 10th centile at that gestational age. Now, first thing is confirming the diagnosis of small for gestational age and fetal growth restriction needs to be done. This will be started as early as 12 weeks, where mother is categorized whether she comes into the high risk or low risk of having a fetus with small for gestational age. The high risk categories include the medical condition like all you know, chronic hypertension, previous baby with IUGR or high BMIs, or any medical disorders like SLEs and APLA syndromes and all. a primigravida, young mother, elderly mother, all these come into the high risk. At 12 weeks, we need to categorize them where they fit in. So, and to that help is a PAPI. Now, PAPI level less than 0.415 multiples of median comes under the high risk category for small for gestational age fetuses. And along with it, uterine artery Dopplers also, if they're more than 95th centile, there is a high risk that this woman might have a small for gestation. In case any of these risk factors are there, low dose aspirin, ecosprin 150 milligrams needs to be started at 12 weeks itself. Now, these babies needs to be monitored for growth from 26 to 28 weeks of gestation. When at 26-28 weeks of gestation, any mother who had a growth scan has a fetus less than 10 centile or abdominal circumference falling less than 10 centile need to have a proper fetal surveillance. Now, fetal surveillance is monitoring the growth of the baby by regular antenatal checkups and ultrasounds, explaining the mother how to monitor her fetal movements. Now, scans for growth can be done if the umbilical artery Doppler, all the Doppler studies are normal. Scans should be repeated if we find a small for gestational fetus, 2 to 3 weeks depending upon the severity. If the Dopplers are abnormal, like the umbilical artery Doppler shows increased resistance, then there needs to be a Doppler study which is done every weekly along with AFI and CTGs. So that needs to be monitored. Monitoring should be done till 37 weeks if it is only increased resistance with a good amniotic fluid and delivered by 37 completed weeks. Now, these small for gestational age babies with normal Doppler to be delivered by 37 to 38 weeks. Small for gestational or fetal growth restriction babies with increased resistance in umbilical artery Dopplers, monitor them weekly with AFI and weekly Dopplers and CTG and deliver by 36 to 37 weeks. In case if we notice an MCA redistribution, then twice weekly need to be monitored, okay? And with AFI and Doppler again, if any abnormality in CTG or AFI falling less than 5 or Doppler becoming AEDF, consider deliver early. Otherwise, if MCA redistribution, deliver by 36 weeks. If there is an absent end diastolic flow, if it is and the fetus is more than 32 weeks, give a steroid cover, and after steroid cover, we can deliver if CTGs are normal. In case if CTGs is abnormal and absent end diastolic flow is less than 32 weeks, magnesium sulfate in steroid cover, magnesium sulfate for neuroprotection, daily monitoring with Doppler and CTGs needs to be given. Try to continue the pregnancy pull off till 32 weeks if AEDF is continuing. But if the in monitoring we notice any reversal or any abnormal venous Doppler, immediate delivery needs to be done. Okay, any fetus less than 32 weeks, try to give neuroprotection with magnesium sulfate. Now, coming to multiple pregnancies. Now, multiple pregnancies and uncomplicated DCDA dichorionic diamniotic twins can be delivered by 37. Should be delivered by 37 weeks, max by 37 plus 6 weeks. The stillbirth rate goes high after 37 plus 6 weeks. And uncomplicated monochorionic diamniotic twins delivered by 36 weeks itself. More than 36 plus 6 weeks, again the stillbirth rate increases. If monochorionic diamniotic twins has any TTTS with type 1 growth restriction, consider delivery between 34 to 36 weeks. If TTTS is type 2 to type 3 growth restriction, delivered by 32 weeks. In MCMA, delivered by 32 to 33 weeks because of the very high risk of cord entanglement. Triplets, they say delivered by 34 weeks, but most of the triplets deliver set into spontaneous labor by 30-31 weeks maximum. Now coming to RH isoimmunization. Now RH isoimmunization there are antibodies, but they are not increasing. There are no increasing titers. Monitor the titers, and if the patient is stable and titers are not increasing, continue the pregnancy with monitoring and deliver max by 37 to 38 weeks. In case there is increasing titers are there, anti-D titers, there are increasing titers, but when you monitor a fetus with middle cerebral artery, if there are increasing titers, the fetus needs to be monitored with middle cerebral artery Dopplers to check for fetal anemia. In case middle cerebral artery Dopplers are less than 1.5 multiples of median, that indicates not much of anemia. Try to pull on the pregnancy till 35 to 36 weeks, give a steroid cover and deliver. In case if multiples of middle cerebral artery shows increased more than 1.5 MOMs in middle cerebral artery, then the decision of intrauterine transfusion should be taken in collaboration with the fetal medicine department, and depending upon how many intrauterine transfusions are required, what is the gestational age, how the fetus is, all these, the decision when to deliver depends upon in collaboration with the fetal medicine and neonatal department. Now coming to the placental disorders, if we find any accreta, increta, percreta, low-lying placentation, do not wait more than 36 weeks, because once the bleeding starts in accreta, increta, percreta, it will be a major surgery, and always these surgeries are always good when done in a planned daylight. The complications are less compared to when done on an emergency basis, where everything needs to be arranged, surgeon, blood. So always do not, and the risk of bleeding is more after 36 weeks. Do not try to go beyond 36 weeks. And other complications like severe polyhydramnios, and if it is severe polyhydramnios of placental cause causing amniotic maternal discomfort, we can try doing amniotic fluid reduction till 34 weeks, and after 34-36 weeks consider delivery to reduce the maternal distress after steroid cover. Now coming to other medical disorders, cardiac disease, that depends upon what is the condition of the mother, baby. There are no hard and fast rules to deliver early in a cardiac disease patient. That again depends upon what is the severity of the disease, what is the lesion. Most of the cardiac disease set into labor. And renal disease, they say if treatment is renal disease, the RCOG says deliver depending upon severity between 34 to 36 weeks. And in SLEs and APLAs, deliver by 36 to 37 weeks. In intrahepatic cholestasis, as there is a risk of sudden IUFDs and meconium aspiration syndrome, deliver by 36 to 37 weeks. AFLP, acute fatty liver of pregnancy, needs immediate delivery because mortality morbidity is very high in this. And previous term IUFDs without no unknown cause, the management should be individualized depending upon what was the condition, what was the gestational age, whether it was diabetes or any chromosomal problem in the baby or any infections. So individualized decision should be taken in previous IUFD. For any IUFD without any known reason, deliver by 37 to 38 completed weeks. Thank you. From now, I'll hand over to Dr. Kalyan for the next session.
Thank you, madam, for such a lucid, lovely presentation that sets up the thing for mine. So, as a neonatologist, what would I be worried about when I'm called for a delivery? So, as the days are advancing, like over the last 10 years, what we have noticed is more and more babies are surviving in our NICUs, and then we are learning a lot of new ways to optimize care for this extremely low birth weight babies or extreme preterm babies. So if we have to summarize a few things that we have learned from research over the last few days, so there are a lot of things that can be done before the birth of the baby, and a lot more needs to be done in the labor room and subsequently in the NICU. So I'll be going over these standard protocols quickly so that we will understand how we can optimize the care for an extremely low birth weight baby. Coming to the antenatal support, like when we have a fantastic perinatal center, so a ELBW baby's priming can be done, a lot of it can be done before the birth of the baby. The first and foremost, my topic would be irrelevant and incomplete completely if I don't talk about antenatal steroids. If there is one intervention that actually broke the ground in perinatology over the last 20-25 years is antenatal steroids. The second thing would be about Maxell. The third thing would be about the utilization of high vaginal swabs in threatened labor pregnancies, and a little bit on in utero transfer and what is the role, whether there is any evidence to support it. Coming to antenatal steroids, we will just briefly go over why. We all know most of it, but I'll summarize as to why, what is the drug, what is the dose, what is the duration, and what happens if we don't. When we have the smallest of small babies in our ICUs, when we are talking about babies that are 500 grams, 600 grams, 700 grams, which are coming out in these days. And the primary outcomes that we're worried about is RDS, their sepsis rates, their IVH, and necrotizing enterocolitis, and overall the requirement of ventilations, and that determines the prognosis. If we give this simple single intervention of antenatal steroids, it brings down each and every of these outcomes. So when we all know that Cochrane library, probably the most highest level of evidence, the logo of the Cochrane logo, this is of antenatal corticosteroids. So when we have to look at what the Cochrane states, I'll summarize it in the next slide. But what I want to tell you from this big crowded slide is that there seems to be absolutely no contraindication in giving antenatal steroids whenever we are dealing with threatened delivery between 24 to 34 weeks of gestational age. It can bring down perinatal death by 28%. It can bring down mortality by 30%. It can bring down RDS by 30%. It can bring down IVH by about 50%. It can bring down NEC by 50%. So every single aspect of a small baby is dealt with and in a positive way by antenatal steroids, including sepsis. So if we are worried about steroids, and if we are worried that that can cause trouble to the mother or the baby, there seems to be no evidence to support that it is going to cause any trouble. And there seems to be a multi-pronged benefit when we give steroids to the mother. So at this point, what I would request all my colleagues is, even if we find a mother who is going to a higher center or a different center, she comes in pains, the first thing we should do in our emergency is give up the antenatal steroid and then refer. So if she, even though our unit may or may not be able to handle such a delivery or a pregnancy, the simple intervention of giving one dose of steroid can go a long way in terms of the baby's outcome. Second thing is neuroprotection with Maxell. Magnesium sulfate, wonderful drug in terms of tocolysis, wonderful drug in terms of protecting mothers from having a seizure when they have high blood pressure in pregnancy. What was realized is the number needed to treat mothers. So we need to treat about 100 mothers to prevent one seizure in the mothers with high blood pressures. But if we give this drug to mothers with preterm pregnancies, the number needed to treat, the number of treated mothers we need to treat to prevent a case of cerebral palsy is way lower. It is in the tune of 25 to 30. So why do we give the drug? This drug is given to those pregnancies, particularly between 24 to 32 weeks of gestational age, when we anticipate the lady is going to go into labor or deliver in the next 24 hours. So the dose is very simple. It is 6 grams loading over 20 minutes and then 1 gram per hour till delivery. So how do we know that delivery is going to happen? Once the lady is already setting into labor with a dilatation of 4 or more centimeters of cervical dilatation, that's an appropriate time when we can start giving this drug. Thereby, we have enough time to give the drug for cerebral protection. This slide, forget the complicated graph in this, but then this is just the multiple trials and a lot of babies who are included to tell us that it can bring down the chance of cerebral palsy by about 32%. Just by giving this simple drug to the mother before delivery. The third intervention, which we personally thank all of gynecologists if they do it for us, is a high vaginal swab in those mothers who have risk factors where the baby may have sepsis, such as PPROM or preterm labor, or mother having tender uterus, or mother having a high febrile spike or a UTI for that matter. So if we take a high vaginal swab or a cervical swab or a placental swab, all these cultures, when we are dealing with a sick baby in the ICU, will give us a time will give us about 48 hours heads up time, so that we know what is the likely bug that is troubling the baby. The data and the evidence to this kind of approach is on and off. Like there was an MD thesis that was published from Bangalore, which showed that there is a good amount of correlation in a developing nation like India, that if the mother is growing something in the cervix, then it's likely bug that the baby is also going to grow in the blood, if at all we grow something in the blood in the baby. So when we know the culture output of a baby is so low, a culture from the mother can help us guide the management of the baby. In utero transfer, so in utero transfer is for centers where we are not completely equipped to handle a very small baby, and the baby is likely to go to a higher center once the delivery happens. So wherever, if time permits, if the mother is still in early stages of labor, there is enough time the mother can reach safely to a higher center, it is probably safer to transfer the mother than transferring the baby after the birth of the baby. So I was going through a lot of evidence before 2018, whether there is any evidence to support this kind of approach. Like, should we really bother transferring the mother from her place, from our unit to a higher unit? What does it do to the babies and all? There's a beautiful paper that came out last year, which compared 3 groups of babies. One group where the babies were never transferred, they were kept in center. Second group where only the babies were transferred. The third group where mothers were transferred to the higher center. When they looked at the mortality, there didn't seem to be much difference. But when they looked at intact mortality, that is with a baby with no bleed in the brain, babies with normal IQs and normal outcomes in terms of neurology, mothers, when transferred to higher center, the babies did lot better, way lot better than just the babies being transferred in a country like UK, in a nation like UK. Imagine with our bumpy roads, with our traffic, probably the babies are better off transferred with the cushion of the mother's amniotic fluid and going safely to a higher center. Moving on from the mother to the labor room management. What can we do in the labor room to optimize outcomes for these kind of babies? So the first thing is, there are a lot of things that we can do in the labor room, the golden hour management of the baby. The first thing is delayed cord clamping. I'll speak about it in a bit. The second thing is sticking to ILCOR guidelines. There is nothing magical about this particular statement, ILCOR guidelines. It is that we should avoid panic. When you have smallest of small babies, a 400 grammer or a 500 grammer, crying in the labor room, there is bound to be some amount of raised tension among all the people around. So as the team leader of the resuscitation team, it's our responsibility to calm the environment there so that we can do everything appropriately as per guidelines. The third thing is respiratory stabilization right from the labor room. The moment baby is out, baby deserves respiratory support all the way till the time baby is breathing by baby's self. And lastly, but not definitely not the least, is temperature control. We should pay utmost attention to small things like open windows, fans, ACs, everything in the labor room, so that the baby reaches the ICU at a good temperature. Delayed cord clamping. What is delayed cord clamping? We all are aware that delaying the cord clamping and allowing the placental circulation to reach the baby helps the baby in terms of blood, stabilization at all age groups. Now, why is it important for these small babies? Is it feasible at all? In those babies who do not need active resuscitation, that means those babies who come out crying loud and lusty cry, maybe we have this little bit of time of 30 to 45 seconds to allow the central transfusion to happen into the baby. Thereby, this is known to decrease mortality, NAC, IVH, sepsis, need for transfusions, and multiple other outcomes where we are worried about in these small babies. So delayed cord clamping in a systematic manner in thorough guidance for those babies who do not need active resuscitation is shown to do a lot of good as far as baby is concerned. Subsequently, we may move on to probably doing resuscitation while on placental circulation, maybe in the next ILCOR or so. But as of now, this is what is recommended. This is what probably we can try and do in our centers. Admission temperature. Both high and low temperature from the optimal. That is, anything below 36.5 and anything above 37.2 is associated with absolutely poor outcomes in terms of preterm babies, and definitely so in the smallest of small babies. The admission temperature can be addressed when only if we start measuring it and looking at it and then try to correct where things are going wrong. Like I said, simplest thing would be probably switching off the fan and AC in the room of where resuscitation is going to happen. There are a lot of other things that are used in the small babies, like a cling wrap, like using an embrace bag, We have had a small study from the previous center where we worked and showing embrace bag does decrease the incidence of hypothermia. And of course, having hi-fi equipment like a transport trolley, even between your labor room to your own ICU, even the distance is less than 100 feet, but that probably would matter a lot as far as temperature of these small babies is concerned. This is a paper which was published in 2015, which looked at composite outcomes as far as temperature is concerned. Too low or too high is terrible outcomes. If you see this beautiful U-shaped graph, it shows that the optimal outcomes are noticed between 36.5 and 37.2 degrees centigrade. What can we do about these kind of things? Okay, there's small introduction to a particular kind of research called quality improvement, where we know temperature being low or high is bad. We know there are certain things that we need to do to improve them. So we just need to jot down what is going to go wrong and correct them systematically one by one and study the impact of it. So all of us can do in our own labor rooms, or probably this is what we do in our own lives every day. What can I do to better the situation that I'm already in so that things outcomes are better? So similar things can be applied to admission temperatures into ICU, and thereby see there are a lot of quality improvements projects starting from AIIMS to St. John's to all the places where we have done this multiple times to show that temperature can be optimized by addressing small issues. Coming to the second most important aspect of a small baby is the breathing or the respiratory interventions. The first thing I would like to say in respect to breathing is, if the baby is breathing or crying by baby itself, try and avoid intubation where possible. Probably provide pressure support right from the beginning, right from the labor room. Use NeoPuff, use CPAP in the labor room if required. Give early hysterectomy surfactant. If you find the FiO2 rates are higher in the labor room, probably put a small catheter, like deliver the surfactant by a least invasive way. Avoid intubation by whatever it takes in an actively crying baby, however small they are. Just because the baby is small doesn't mean that the baby needs or deserves to be intubated. And if at all we have to intubate such small children because their stress is high or they're not breathing by themselves, then try and use the most gentle modes of ventilation. There is more and more data saying that opting for high frequency ventilation, opting for volume target or volume guarantee ventilation is probably superior to the routine conventional ventilation, so that the lungs are dealt with in a more gentle manner and the outcomes are superior. The outcome when I say about respiratory interventions is BPD. So there are a whole list of things that we do to decrease BPD that probably we'll cover in another session in another webinar. And when possible, when baby allows it, have the threshold for extubation very low and extubate to probably higher values of NIV instead of CPAP, so that maybe will allow you to stay on non-invasive mode of ventilation. Thereby, the chance of BPD becomes lesser and lesser. The third aspect of taking care of a small baby, and personally my favorite and the most important aspect, is infection control. I strongly believe, and what my teacher had first taught me when I first entered NICU is, the only or the most important determinant for outcomes between two NICUs in India is infection rates. If we do everything in our power to wash our hands and to use sterilium when possible, we can bring down the infection rates in our unit. I'll tell you why. Because if we look at the various things that can hurt the baby, right? If you have to jot down the various things that can cause poor brain outcomes for a small baby, the various things are like IVH, asphyxia, sepsis meningitis. Sepsis meningitis stands as rank number 1 as far as poor outcomes are concerned. If a baby has meningitis, that will really be, the outcomes will be terrible in such a baby as compared to baby who has had bleed or probably asphyxia, of course, depending on the stage and severity. Infection control can be improved by doing small things, small changes, by awareness and knowledge among all the healthcare workers of washing hands using sterilium. This is a slide I want to share from where I was trained back when I was a DM graduate. So we began the infection control project in the year 2014. And by the year 2016, it's heartwarming to see that the outcomes of survival in babies less than a kg touched 90% in a very busy center. And the outcomes of babies less than 750 grams among babies who opted for care is drastically more than 80%, but among all the babies is also more than 50%. So which used to be zero, like no baby ever survived before that. Just by taking care of infection control, outcomes have dramatically changed in such units. Nutrition, the third prong of caring a small baby. So if we need to have safely accessible central lines so that we can start high amounts of parental nutrition, so that we can give good amount of nutrition right from hour zero of the baby. So the moment baby is born, the expertise should allow us to put central lines in a safe manner and then start parental nutrition at a high volume as the baby tolerates. Begin feeds early and preferably only mother milk wherever it's available. Use colostrum early. Use minimal enteral nutrition whenever the mother expresses milk immediately, whenever the baby allows it, and whenever the mother has milk. And having a fixed protocol for escalation of this oral feeds is known to give the best outcomes as far as feed tolerance and NEC rates are concerned of the unit. With small babies, when we are escalating feeds, one important outcome we are worried about is NEC. Have a fixed protocol, 35 ml per kg per day or 30 ml per kg per day. So what your unit decides, stick to it, and then try to escalate it in a controlled manner. Then you're bound to have very good outcomes as far as NEC is concerned. One area that is constantly ignored when we take care of babies in busy units or in smaller units or in any unit for that matter is developmental supportive care. We all should remember that this baby, which was in a calm atmosphere inside the mother's tummy, which was supposed to be there for the next 2 to 3 months or even 4 months, has come to a completely busy unit, which is constantly alarming with all sorts of alarms from the ventilator, from the warmer, from the multipara monitor and all that. We should give a very developmentally supportive unit to the baby. We should take care of the pain. We should take care of the sleep. We should take care of. We should cluster the activities. We should involve the family where possible, and provide a healing environment within the NICU. And the awareness should be among all the nurses, doctors, residents, and even the parents, so that the whole unit will support such a small baby doing better. Abroad, when like there are units in UK and all where such small babies born before 26, 27 weeks are kept in a completely separate room, which is constantly dark and constantly silent, so that these babies get the best atmosphere for beautiful outcomes. Outcomes are not done the moment baby starts from the ICU. This baby needs to be followed very closely for any kind of trouble over the next 2 years. So having a designated high-risk follow-up multimodal clinic is extremely important. This clinic should have a developmental pediatrician, a neonatologist, occupational therapist, physiotherapist, speech therapist, nutritionist, lactation specialist. All these people should analyze this baby in a single go to give what is lacking for this baby to provide the best outcome, because early intervention in the first 3 years is known to give the best outcomes in these kind of babies. To sum up, it takes like an old African saying, it takes a whole village to raise a child, but probably it takes a whole village of experts and specialists to take care of such a small baby. Antenatally, we need antenatal steroids, Maxil as a very important aspect. Send high vaginal swab or placental swab so that it will give you a heads up and a head start as far as baby's infections are concerned. Delay the cot clamping when feasible. Try non-invasive ventilation where the baby allows it. If you have to intubate the baby and ventilate the baby, early extubation. Give good amounts of nutrition to the baby right from the beginning. Breast milk based enteral feeds and start them early and escalate them in a protocolized manner. Infection control, infection control, infection control. I can't stress anymore because it is the most important aspect as far as small babies outcomes are concerned. And developmental supportive care unit with a good follow-up over the next 2 to 2.5 years will provide a child spotless and gives the family a beautiful 5-year-old running around kid. That's what we all aim for. Thank you.
Any questions? I think the dose of the magnesium sulfate for uroprotection is already answered by Dr. Kalyan. Any other questions can be taken?
We'll also be happy to answer questions. If you have any, you can mail us, and then from our team, when we get the questions, we'll probably be happy to answer them and probably get in touch with you in person. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for attending the webinar.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye. Have a nice day.